Welcome back to the Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. This is episode 37, and today we're diving into the years between the World Wars, from 1919 through the Great Depression. Dr. Morgan is here with us. Hi, Dr. Morgan. Can you help us get our bearings for this episode?
Absolutely, Casey. Today we're looking at a Europe that had survived the First World War but hadn't really recovered from it. Politically, many countries tried to rebuild democratic institutions. Economically, they struggled to pay war debts, rebuild industries, and stabilize currencies. The key theme is fragility, because by the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s, the entire international system collapsed into the Great Depression.
And we also have Professor Theo with us. Hi, Professor Theo. What should we be watching for in terms of society and culture during this time?
Thanks, Casey. People in the 1920s desperately wanted stability and a return to normal life. But beneath the surface, there was anxiety, economic stress, divided societies, and trauma from the war itself. Social class conflicts, struggles between workers and employers, and new expectations around gender roles all shaped daily experience in the interwar years. And when the Depression hit, those social pressures intensified.
Okay, so this episode is like, Europe survived the war, but the peace wasn't peaceful. Let's jump in. Dr. Morgan, why did Europe have such a hard time stabilizing right after the war? Weren't the peace treaties supposed to fix things?
In theory, yes. And to really understand why Germany struggled so profoundly, we need to look more closely at what the Treaty of Versailles demanded. The treaty required Germany to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, an astronomical sum far beyond what the German economy could reasonably produce. These payments weren't just symbolic. They were meant to cover physical destruction in France and Belgium, pensions for widows and veterans, and massive war debts the Allies themselves owed to the United States. Germany had lost territory, industrial regions, and overseas colonies, so its capacity to generate wealth was sharply reduced at the very moment its obligations skyrocketed. German leaders protested that the sum was unpayable, and many economists, including John Maynard Keynes, warned that such harsh financial terms would destabilize Europe rather than secure peace. But the treaties ended the fighting without solving the underlying economic and political problems. Here are the big ones. First, war debts and reparations. Germany owed huge payments to the Allies, and the Allies owed money to the United States. Everyone was waiting on someone else to pay first. Second, inflation and financial chaos. Countries had borrowed massively during the war. Afterward, they printed money to stay afloat, which caused prices to explode, especially in Germany. Third, new borders and new nations. The map of Europe was redrawn, creating new countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. These states had to create governments from scratch and unite groups with different languages, cultures, and goals.
Can I pause you there? What exactly is inflation again? I know we hear that term today too.
Good question. Inflation means prices go up because your currency loses value. If a loaf of bread cost 1 mark yesterday and 10 today, that's inflation. After World War I, inflation spun out of control in some countries, especially Germany, where a famous crisis called hyperinflation made money practically worthless.
And that had an enormous social impact. Workers were paid twice a day because prices rose between morning and afternoon. Middle-class families saw their savings disappear. Imagine saving for years and suddenly discovering your savings won't even buy a postage stamp.
That would be devastating. Why was Germany hit so much harder than other countries?
Germany faced enormous reparations, payments demanded by the Allies, and struggled to meet them. In 1923, when Germany fell behind on payments, France and Belgium sent troops to occupy the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland.
So they basically took over German factories?
Exactly. The German government told workers to strike rather than cooperate with the occupation. To keep paying those striking workers, the government printed more money, and that triggered hyperinflation.
People began carrying money in baskets or suitcases. Children made kites out of banknotes. Everyday life became surreal. And socially, the crisis created an overwhelming sense of humiliation and fear, emotions that would later make radical solutions seem appealing.
You're foreshadowing fascism there, right?
Lightly, because we're saving the full story for episode 39. But yes, economic despair created political openings for extremist groups.
But things did get better for a while in the mid-1920s, right?
They did, thanks to international cooperation. The standout example is the Dawes Plan of 1924.
What was that?
The Dawes Plan was an agreement in which the United States loaned money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay reparations, and the Allies used the reparations to pay back loans to the U.S. It was a sort of financial triangle.
So money went in a circle?
Exactly. And although it wasn't a perfect solution, it stabilized European economies for several years. But it's important to remember what this stability rested on: a constant flow of American money into Germany. Without those loans, Germany could not meet reparations payments. Without reparations, France and Britain could not service their own debts to the United States. It was a fragile structure, a financial house of cards. And when the United States faltered in 1929, the entire system collapsed almost overnight.
This stability translated into social optimism. Cities rebuilt, people returned to work. Cultural life in places like Berlin and Paris flourished. There was a sense, especially among younger people, that Europe could move past the trauma of the war.
Did the governments feel more stable too?
In many cases, yes. Germany's Weimar Republic seemed to be gaining strength. France recovered economically. Britain adjusted to peacetime conditions, although it struggled with unemployment. And there were major diplomatic achievements, like the Locarno Treaties of 1925.
What were those?
Locarno was a series of agreements in which Germany, France, and Belgium promised not to change their borders by force. Britain and Italy agreed to help enforce the deal. It felt like a new era of peace.
And don't forget the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, where nearly every major country renounced war as a way to solve conflicts. It didn't prevent future wars, but it reflected powerful public desire for peace.
So the mid-1920s were a kind of calm before the storm.
Exactly. Life wasn't perfect, but there was genuine hope.
But that hope didn't last. What was still fragile underneath?
Several key problems. First, overdependence on American loans. If U.S. banks pulled back, the whole system would collapse. Second, uneven prosperity. Some industries boomed while others, especially agriculture, struggled. Third, weak international trade. Countries raised tariffs to protect their industries, which hurt global commerce. Fourth, political divisions. Even in good years, democracies across Europe were divided between conservatives, liberals, socialists, and new extremist groups.
And on the social side, wage workers felt insecure, farmers faced debt, and veterans struggled to reintegrate. Many people felt that democracy wasn't solving their problems.
So when the economy crashed, everything unraveled fast?
Very fast.
Okay, here's the big one. What actually happened in 1929? Dr. Morgan. In October 1929, the American stock market collapsed. Investors panicked and sold shares at any price. Banks failed as people rushed to withdraw their money. Businesses closed. And because Europe depended on American loans, the crisis spread almost instantly. So the U.S. crash basically pulled Europe down with it?
Exactly. American banks recalled their loans from Germany and Austria. Without those loans, European banks collapsed. International trade shrank dramatically. In response to the ongoing crisis, the United States attempted limited interventions. In 1931, President Herbert Hoover proposed the Hoover Moratorium, a one-year suspension of all international debt payments, both German reparations and Allied war debts. It was meant to stabilize the financial system, but it proved too little, too late. European economies were already unraveling. Industrial production fell by 1/3 or more in many countries. As the crisis deepened, international leaders met again to address reparations. At the Lausanne Conference of 1932, Britain and France agreed to end Germany's reparations entirely, recognizing that the payments were impossible under Depression conditions. But the plan depended on the United States canceling Allied war debts, and Congress refused. Even so, reparations effectively ceased, marking the collapse of the entire Versailles-era financial system.
And the human cost was enormous. By the early 1930s, 1 in 3 German workers was unemployed. British unemployment reached massive levels. Farmers across Europe faced falling prices and crushing debt. Families lost homes, savings, and hope. People lined up for bread, relied on charity, and moved in search of work.
It sounds like everything just fell apart.
That's exactly how people felt. The Depression created a sense of despair that shook the foundations of democratic societies.
How did governments try to fix things? Did anyone have a plan?
At first, most governments made the crisis worse. They believed in laissez-faire economics, meaning the government should not interfere in the economy. So they cut budgets, reduced spending, and tried to balance their national finances.
Wait, they cut spending during a recession?
Yes, and those cuts deepened the crisis. It wasn't until later that economists realized that governments sometimes need to spend more during downturns to stimulate the economy.
Socially, these cutbacks meant closing welfare programs, reducing unemployment benefits, and offering little support to desperate families. It left people feeling abandoned.
So who handled the crisis better?
Britain approached the Depression with caution. But even before the Depression hit, Britain had faced major labor unrest. In 1926, the country experienced the General Strike, one of the largest in its history. It began when mine owners tried to cut wages for coal miners after years of declining coal prices. The Trades Union Congress called a nationwide strike in support of the miners. For 9 tense days, transportation workers, printers, dock workers, and others refused to work, bringing the country close to a standstill.
The strike revealed deep class tensions. Many working-class families saw it as a fight for dignity, while middle and upper-class Britons viewed it as a threat to national stability. The Conservative government mobilized volunteers to keep essential services running and refused to negotiate on union terms. Eventually, the strike ended without major concessions, and it weakened the labor movement for years. Britain carried these tensions into the Depression, making it even harder for communities to recover. The government took the country off the gold standard, which allowed the pound to drop in value. That made British exports cheaper and helped stabilize the economy somewhat.
What's the gold standard?
It's when the value of your currency is tied to a fixed amount of gold. Leaving the gold standard allowed Britain more flexibility.
Socially, Britain protected some welfare programs and invested in housing, which helped certain regions. But unemployment remained high, especially in older industrial areas.
France didn't feel the Depression immediately. Its economy had been more insulated, and people saved money in ways that protected them temporarily. But when the crisis hit in the mid-1930s, it struck hard. France's politics became bitterly polarized between the far left and the far right. Riots in 1934 shook public trust. Eventually, a coalition called the Popular Front won elections in 1936.
What did the Popular Front do?
They introduced social reforms, paid vacations, a 40-hour work week, and collective bargaining rights. These changes improved working-class life, but business owners pushed back, and the coalition collapsed within 1 year.
So even when governments tried bold ideas, it didn't always last. I've heard Scandinavia did something different during the Depression. What was their strategy?
Scandinavia created what historians call social democracy, a political system that supports democracy but also commits to strong social welfare programs.
Instead of cutting spending, Scandinavian governments worked with labor unions and business leaders to negotiate solutions. They increased government spending, built public works, and provided generous unemployment insurance.
That sounds kind of like modern welfare states.
Exactly. Social democracy in Scandinavia during the Depression became a model for later social policies across the world.
And socially, these policies helped people feel protected. When people believe their government cares about their well-being, they're more likely to support democratic institutions.
So Scandinavia is this example of how democracy can survive a crisis if it actually helps people. We're AP Euro, but can we talk about the U.S. just enough to get context?
Sure. Under Franklin Roosevelt, the U.S. launched the New Deal, which used government spending to create jobs, support farmers, and regulate banks. Europe watched closely. Some praised it, and others criticized it as too interventionist.
And it inspired reformers across Europe who wanted governments to take a more active role in helping ordinary citizens.
So here's what I really want to understand. Why did the Depression weaken democracies so badly?
Because democracy depends on hope and trust. When people lose jobs, homes, and savings, they begin to question whether their leaders know what they're doing.
Exactly. And political scientists point to a few specific reasons. 1. High unemployment eroded faith in democratic governments. When millions are out of work, slow parliamentary debates feel useless. 2. Polarization increased. Extremist parties on both the far left and the far right promised bold action. 3. Governments fell rapidly. Coalitions collapsed. Elections produced fragmented parliaments. 4. Violence increased. Political street fighting, especially in Germany and Austria, made democracy feel unstable.
At the social level, people longed for security. They wanted strong leadership, quick solutions, and a clear direction. That emotional environment made authoritarian ideas attractive. But again, the full rise of fascism and Nazism is our story for episode 39.
Okay, so the Depression didn't cause fascism by itself, but it created conditions where people were more likely to support extreme solutions. Earlier, you mentioned things like the Locarno Treaties and Kellogg-Briand Pact. Did those agreements fall apart during the Depression?
Sadly, yes. As economies crashed, governments focused inward, tariffs rose, international loans stopped, diplomacy weakened.
Countries that had once promised peace now started to rearm. The Depression didn't just hurt wallets. It damaged the entire international system.
And this breakdown eventually set the stage for the next war?
Yes, but again, we're saving that story for episode 39. For today, the key point is that the Depression shattered the hope for long-term peace created in the 1920s.
Before we zoom in on everyday life, I know there was also a lot of cultural and intellectual uncertainty after the war. New scientific theories, psychological ideas, and artistic movements. But since episode 38 will focus entirely on those cultural responses, we'll save the details for next time. I'd like to zoom back in on ordinary people. What did life look like on the ground? What did life look like on the ground?
For many families, life revolved around survival. Searching for work, stretching food budgets, moving in with relatives, wearing repaired or second-hand clothes, growing vegetables in backyard gardens. Women often shouldered the burden of making scarce resources last. Men sometimes felt ashamed when they couldn't support their families. Children left school early to help work.
That sounds emotionally exhausting.
It was. And society became more divided. Some blamed bankers or foreigners or minority groups. Others blamed the political system. These tensions contributed to the collapse of democratic trust.
I'm still thinking about Scandinavia. Why were they the exception?
They had strong labor movements, cooperative business leaders, and a political culture that valued negotiation.
And importantly, they built welfare systems that reduced fear. When people know they can get medical care or unemployment support, they're less desperate and less drawn to radical politics.
So, Scandinavia is like a case study in how democracy can work if you protect people. Before we wrap up, can we connect this briefly to what's coming in episode 39?
Sure, but very lightly. By the late 1930s, Germany's democracy had collapsed, Italy's democracy had collapsed. Authoritarian regimes had spread across Eastern Europe. France and Britain remained democratic but were exhausted by the Depression. The crisis created an unstable world where aggressive dictators could act without strong resistance.
But that's where we'll pick up in episode 39. For now, just remember, the Depression didn't automatically cause war, but it weakened the institutions that could have prevented war.
And that brings us to the end of episode 37 of The Once and Future Present. Today we explored how Europe struggled to rebuild after World War I, found a brief moment of hope in the 1920s, and then plunged into the chaos of the Great Depression. We'll see the political consequences of all that when we return in episode 39. But next time, we're switching gears. Episode 38 will take us through Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, Dada, and Surrealism. Basically, all the artistic ways people tried to make sense of a chaotic world. Dr. Morgan, Professor Theo, thank you both for being here.
Always a pleasure, Casey.
Looking forward to next time.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. Remember, stay curious, think critically,